Hi guys, Adam here again. I'm puffing and panting because we're climbing up this hill, but I just had to show you this. Look at this. This is a poplar tree, but look at the way these kind of triangle diamond shapes. It's kind of indicative of a poplar when it's this age, because when they grow bigger, the bark at the bottom gets rougher and has a different texture. But at this age, they have these beautiful diamond shapes. And I always think, I don't have any tattoos, and I don't particularly like tattoos, but some of the traditional tattoos you see where I used to live, like in Hawaii or in the Pacific, often they have shapes like this. So if I was going to have a tattoo, which I'm not, I would kind of like this. Another thing you could imagine, a game I do with people when they're out with me, if you were out with me now, we'd be doing this perhaps on a day like this, is try and interpret the text. Because imagine this is some sort of writing. Okay, it's not. But why not use your imagination? What could this be saying? Do you think it has any meaning? If you wanted to give this some sort of, make it into some sort of language, a message that's left, if only you could read the language of nature, like Braille or like Morse code, maybe there's some special message just for you. Of course, if you take that too far, you go crazy. But, you know, in most of human history, we've been reading the signs around us to try finding meaning and find connections between things. And I think now, many of us, we've forgotten how connected we are, and perhaps starting to see some meaning in things that are abstract gets interesting. And of course, I'm talking about art here. So, look out your window, man. Look out what's around you. Check it out. Get inspired. And then give something from that, okay? It's the 5th of April, and we had the first cuckoo. I heard the first cuckoo a couple of days ago, and we found our first orchid today. And it's this orchid here, which is called the fly orchid, or Ophrys insectifera. And a lot of the orchids that grow, in fact all the orchids that grow in Europe and most of those in Asia and Western Asia, are terrestrial, so they grow in the ground. They're not epiphytic like a lot of the tropical orchids, the ones that now they have house plants of, that grow in big showy blossoms and grow in trees. So these ones are often small, like this one's only about 20 centimeters tall. And this one's called the insect orchid. Well, you can see why perhaps. It actually looks just like a little fly. That's why it's called the fly orchid. And it's even got little antennae, it looks like little wings. And the amazing thing about this is it's a bit of a racy story of sexual deception and co-evolution. This species of orchid here has evolved over millions of years with a particular species, probably of a solitary bee, a little tiny bee, that looks a bit like this. And this orchid here imitates a female bee. It's called sexual deception. And a male bee who maybe comes out in the springtime, and one of the first things it will want to do after having something to eat will be look for a mate, look for a female so they can reproduce. And the male bee will be flying around, and it will suddenly smell the most beautiful perfume, pheromones, chemical messengers. And the pheromone, the chemical, smells just like the perfume of a beautiful female bee in the same species. So it'll follow the smell and come to this, because this orchid has that level of deception. Not only does this look like a female bee, not only does it feel like a female bee if you touch it, but it smells like a female bee. So it's imitated the exact pheromone that one species of bee produces. So the male bee comes along and decides to have a little cuddle, and it grabs on, and it's called pseudo-copulation, which is a little bit rude, but it's science, so it's okay. And it grabs on, and it tries to have a bit of where it does some pseudo-copulation, and the orchid here will dump a little bit of pollen, probably on its head, or maybe on its abdomen. And after a while, the male bee gets a bit frustrated because this female bee is really not being very receptive and is not very interesting company. So he decides, well, okay, and a frustrated and a bit upset male bee goes flying off, and in this area there'll be many other of these orchids, and it'll smell another beautiful female bee. Off he goes, lands on the bee for a bit of pseudo-copulation, and will release, and the pollen will go and will pollinate the other orchids. So these orchids have got a strategy where they get pollinated by deceiving bees, these particular species of solitary bees, to believe that this is a female bee, and this is their strategy. They've co-evolved together to get pollinated, these orchids. Now, if the bee disappears, the orchids won't get pollinated, the orchids will disappear. If the orchids disappear, well, the bees will probably survive, because it's not a very mutualistic arrangement. The bee doesn't probably get too much from this arrangement, apart from a bit frustrated. But what an amazing story. I mean, imagine that. This orchid, it seems like it's doing it consciously, although in evolutionary terms it wouldn't be true to talk in those terms. But what a story, huh? And as time goes on, if we're still on lockdown, which I hope we're not going to be, we'll show you some other of these special wild orchids that grow in our area, because there's some really extraordinary ones, and they'll just be coming out in late April and May. Anyway, take care, guys. An amazing story of sexual deception and pseudo-copulation with Ophrys insetivora, the fly orchid.